Life has a way of putting you in circumstances you never would have predicted. It seems like you have everything worked out 1 minute, and then your entire world gets flipped upside down. I am Claire, a 33-year-old lady who has been married to Jonathan for 8 years. Together with our 2 children, Noah and Lily, we have a peaceful life in a lovely suburban community. Together, Jonathan and I have faced many challenges, including balancing careers, raising a family, and attempting to maintain our marriage in the face of adversity. However, it seems to me that we have been drifting apart lately, as like we are merely going through the motions without truly connecting. Jessica, my closest friend, has supported me through everything. Since our first day of college together, we have been inseparable. She is the person I call when I want to celebrate, when I need to rant, or even simply when I want to sit quietly. We've spent several weekends together since Jessica and her husband, David, moved to our neighborhood almost 2 years ago. We've had family meals, barbecues, and the occasional wine night where we would giggle until our stomachs hurt. David and Jessica appeared to have the ideal marriage. They constantly seemed to be in sync and were affectionate. I must admit that I admired them. They were that pair that, despite years of dating, made marriage seem easy, as if they were still deeply in love. However, I've learned that things aren't always as they seem. It all began one evening while Jonathan was working out of town. I was feeling really lonely, and he had been traveling a lot lately. Because one of her children wasn't feeling well, Jessica had to abruptly cancel her invitation to join her for a wine night. Naturally, I understood, but the disappointment persisted. I was so excited to relax with my best friend after such a difficult week. I was going to unwind with a movie and a drink of wine later that night when someone knocked on the door. I was shocked to see David standing there with a bottle of wine in his hand and a warm smile on his face because I hadn't expected anyone. His voice was light as he said, "Hey, Claire. I've heard that Jessica had to postpone your date for tonight. I wanted to drop over and check if you needed some company." I am aware of how isolating Jonathan's absence can be. I paused for a second, wondering if we should be hanging around alone like this. Then I thought, why not? We were all tight, and David was Jessica's husband. I also didn't want to stay up all night thinking about nothing. I answered, "Sure, come in," and moved aside to make room for him. The wine was flowing as we engaged in small talk while seated in the living room. Everything was light-hearted and informal at first. David discussed his job, the children, and Jessica's recent handling of everything. However, the discussion became more intimate as the evening went on. We began discussing our marriages and the difficulties we were both having. David answered, "I don't know, Claire," in a frustrated tone. "Jessica and I feel more like roommates than husband and wife at times. We seldom have time for one another now because we are both so preoccupied with our jobs and the kids. You can probably relate." I nodded while reflecting about my own marriage and experiencing a twinge of shame. Yes, things have been difficult lately. When Jonathan returns home from his constant travels, we are both so worn out that we seldom speak. We seem to be leading parallel lives. Swirling the wine in his glass, David reclined on the couch. "Isn't it difficult? Before you know it, you're simply going through the motions. You get married with the expectation that it will be an amazing union, but life gets in the way." I nodded in accord and sighed. Exactly. It seems as though the spark has vanished, and I have no idea how to restore it. For a while, we sat in silence, each of us deep in meditation. I didn't understand how much I needed to express my feelings aloud and talk about this. However, as the discussion went on, I became aware that David was staring at me in a new way. I had never noticed the heat and intensity in his eyes before, and it made my stomach turn. His eyes were fixed on mine as he whispered, "I've always admired you, Claire. You are an amazing woman. You are a blessing to Jonathan." I was surprised by what he said, and my cheeks began to flush. I tried to dismiss it as a casual compliment and said, "Thank you, David. That's very kind of you to say that." David, however, refused to let it go. Placing his drink on the sofa table, he leaned slightly closer and spoke in a low, almost personal manner. "No, I do mean it. You are intelligent, attractive, and possess a strength that I have always found admirable. Jonathan, may not be aware of his good fortune. Now, in addition to perplexity, my pulse was pounding for another reason that I didn't want to mention. I ought to have abruptly ended the talk and instructed him to go before it got out of hand. However, I didn't. Rather, I sat there with my head whirling, staring at him. "I'm at a loss for words," I muttered, my voice shaking. With unwavering eyes, David answered, "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to express my feelings to you." David reached out and softly clasped my hand in his before I could comprehend what was happening. I felt a jolt that I couldn't ignore from the electric touch. I ought to have backed off and informed him that this was improper and that we couldn't proceed. However, I didn't. Rather, I allowed him to grasp my hand, the tension between us palpable. My heart was thumping in my chest, and my thoughts was racing. This was the spouse of my best friend, Jessica. I couldn't allow this to occur. However, despite my best efforts to persuade myself to stop, a part of me remained unwilling to do so. I couldn't quite put my finger on why I was pulled to David. Before I knew it, David was leaning in and gently kissing me while the moment dragged on. At first, the kiss was timid and soft, as though he was waiting for me to back off. However, I didn't. My hand moved to his shoulder as I gave him a deeper kiss in return. We were both gasping for air and pressing our foreheads into one another when we eventually separated. With sadness and longing in my voice, I muttered, "David, this is not possible." With his eyes still closed, he whispered, "I know, but I'm powerless to stop it. This is something I've wanted for a very long time." The weight of what we had just done settled over us like a thick cloud as we sat there in silence. Even though I knew we had gone too far and there would be repercussions, I couldn't bring myself to feel bad about it at the time. When I eventually answered, "I don't know what this means," my voice was almost audible above a whisper. "Neither do I," David said in a similarly quiet voice. "But I'm aware that I don't want this to be the final instance." As I thought of Jessica and Jonathan, his comments made me shudder and made me feel guilty. They weren't treated fairly. A part of me didn't want to stop, even though we were both betraying the people we loved. I retreated from him and said, "I need some time to think." With a sad grimace, David nodded. "I get it. Take as much time as you require." I sat on the couch that night as he left, my head spinning from everything that had just transpired. I was aware that I had erred by allowing my feelings to control me. In actuality, though, I couldn't get myself to feel bad about it. Following that, the days were a haze of mixed feelings. I kept thinking about that evening with David and how he had affected my emotions. I hadn't felt wanted or really seen by anyone in such a long time. Despite being married for 8 years, Jonathan and I had lost our connection at some point. Naturally, our love for one another remained, but the spark that had once characterized our relationship had faded. Work, children, and other obligations had gotten in the way, and we had ceased prioritizing one another. Something I didn't even know I was lacking had been roused within of me by David. However, that did not make it correct. I was aware that our actions betrayed not only Jessica, but also my marriage. I couldn't help but feel drawn to him, despite my best efforts to ignore such emotions. I met Jessica at the park a few days later. It seemed like just two best friends catching up, and we were both there with our children. However, I had a rush of shame as we conversed. She was unaware of what had transpired between David and me, nor was she aware that the man she loved had admitted his emotions for me and kissed me. Standing there and acting like nothing was wrong when I was concealing such a big secret made me feel like a phony. "How are you doing?" Jessica inquired in a relaxed manner. "I think it's been a long time since we had a proper catch-up." I tried to maintain a steady voice while forcing a grin. "Yes, things have been a little busy recently. You know, with Jonathan on the road and everything." She gave a sympathetic nod. "I understand. It's been difficult for David, who has also been working long hours. We don't seem to see each other very often at times." Her remarks were like a kick to the stomach. I was betraying her behind her back as she confided in me about her marriage and her troubles. I wanted to be honest with her, to own up to everything, to make things right, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't be the one to break her heart, because it would ruin her. I answered, my voice tense with emotion. Yeah, it's tough. But I have no doubt that things will improve. I became sidetracked as the discussion went on, my mind returning to David. I wasn't sure how to feel about the fact that I hadn't seen him since that evening. A part of me felt relieved and thankful for the space that helped me think. However, I also missed the way he had made me feel and the way he had looked at me. After I had put the kids to bed later that night, David texted me. Can we have a conversation? Unsure of how to react, I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I was aware that I needed to ignore it and wait for things to calm down before they became any more problematic. However, the allure remained, the temptation too great to ignore. Yes. What are you thinking about? Jessica was at work the following day, so we decided to meet then. Sneaking around like this felt terrible, but I convinced myself that we needed to sort things out, figure out what was going on between us, and decide how to proceed. There was a level of anxiety in the air when David showed up at my house the following afternoon. We sat in the living room, and at first, neither of us knew how to begin the conversation. Finally breaking the silence, David stated, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And Claire, you're always on my mind. I can't help but feel this way, even though I know it's bad and confusing. I was overcome with feelings of pleasure, guilt, and dread after hearing his confession. I had also been thinking about him, again reliving that kiss in my head. Despite my attraction to him, I felt that we couldn't continue in this direction. Even though my heart hurt, I answered firmly, David, we can't do this. You're Jessica's spouse, and she is my best friend. This is unfair to everyone, even though I care about you. I understand, he said, his face hurt. However, I can't stop thinking about you and our potential relationship. Claire, it's been years since I've felt this way. Not with anyone, not with Jessica. His comments had a powerful effect on me, and for a split second, I considered giving in and allowing myself to be carried away by this emotional tornado. However, I was unable to. I couldn't ruin my own marriage, and I couldn't betray Jessica. I responded, getting to my feet and putting some distance between us. We must stop. Too many people will be harmed by this, David. We cannot continue in this manner. I could see the turmoil in his eyes, but he nodded. You're correct. You're correct, I know that. However, that doesn't make things any simpler. We remained silent for a while as the consequences of our choice weighed heavily on us. Even though I knew this was the proper thing to do, the agony was still there. It seemed like I was losing something significant when I let go of David, something I hadn't even known I needed until now. I was both relieved and sad when he left that day. Even though I had taken the correct decision, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if we had been allowed to explore whatever this was between us. The ensuing weeks were challenging. In an attempt to re-establish the relationship with Jonathan that had been eroding for so long, I put myself into my family. We resumed our date evenings and spent more time together, and I gradually started to sense that we were getting back in touch. Even though Jonathan and I were getting along better, I couldn't get David out of my head. Since that day, we hadn't spoken, and the guilt still bothered me whenever I saw Jessica. She was unaware of what had transpired, and each time I smiled and acted that nothing was wrong, I couldn't help but feel as though I was betraying her. After that, one night, Jessica texted me, Can we talk, please? I read the message and felt sick to my stomach. Was she aware? Did David tell her? I couldn't get rid of the sense of dread that descended upon me as my imagination raced with a million potential outcomes. Naturally. Is everything all right? She responded right away. No, not at all. May I visit? I waited for her, my heart thumping in my chest. She knocked on the door, and when I opened it, she was standing there with teary, puffy eyes. What's the matter? I pulled her into an embrace and requested. Her voice was tremulous as she said, It's David. I believe he has been. I'm not sure, aloof. Something seems off, and I'm at a loss on what to do. I felt a feeling of guilt go over me. She was unaware that the secret I had been holding from her was the reason behind the distance she was experiencing. I wanted to be honest with her and tell her everything, but I was unable to do so. She would be ruined, and I couldn't stand to be the one to cause her such pain. I tried to soothe her by saying, "I'm sure it's nothing. Perhaps he's simply under stress at work. You folks have experienced a lot recently." Jessica wiped away her tears and nodded. "Yes, perhaps. I simply don't know. He seems to be sliding away, and I'm not sure how to stop it." Even though the guilt kept eating away at me, I tried my best to be there for her as we spent hours on the couch discussing her frustrations and anxieties. For the sake of my marriage and my friendship with Jessica, I knew I had to let go of any feelings I might have had for David. In actuality, though, I wasn't sure if I could. I kept struggling with my emotions over time, attempting to balance my devotion to Jonathan, my loyalty to Jessica, and my affections for David. Although it wasn't simple, I gradually began to put David out of my mind in order to work on saving my own marriage and being Jessica's best friend. Ultimately, I came to the realization that, despite their seeming allure, some boundaries should never be broken. I had retreated before it was too late, but I had been on the verge of losing all I valued. Although it wasn't simple, it was the proper course of action. In retrospect, I realized that temptation is ever present, waiting for a moment of vulnerability while hiding in the shadows. However, it is up to us to choose to resist or give in. In the end, it all came down to my decision to stand my ground and defend the people I cared about.